Good afternoon and welcome to the third of our economic sessions here from Emsi Burning Glass, and this one's going to be about regional economic growth. I'm Duncan Brown. I'm an economist by background, and I am the Vice President for Innovation in the Global Business Unit. So I've got a few slides to walk you through today. What we're going to talk about is what economic growth is and isn't, the importance of what we call functional economic areas and how geography interacts with the economy there as well, the nature of industry specialization, and also how we see industry change and concentrating in varying areas as well. So some caveats, and I've used the same caveats for the previous sessions as well, so they should be familiar by now. This is very much a high-level view of economics for a policy and strategy audience. It's a very simplified introduction, really just focusing on the broad concepts that are good to know about in terms of discussing it. So you should be able to kind of bluff your way through a discussion on regional economic growth by the end of it. Therefore, there are many special cases that we won't cover, and so if you know about the subject, I'm sure you could come at me with all kinds of points about, oh, but what about this situation and that situation? But we're focusing on the main headlines. Probably going to be talking for the better part of an hour. It's no substitute for a full course that you might do at a university or over multiple sessions online. And really, it's just to help people think of it better about the economic forces that shape their own work in terms of thinking about the labour market and how it is impacted by economic growth. So we're going to start off with economic growth, and what do we mean by economic growth first of all? So what it means is more output and more income. So in previous sessions we talked about how we measure GDP, and GDP is the total amount of output created by the economy, so the amount of value created in goods and services. And it should, in principle, from an accounting perspective, equal the amount of income in the economy. So the amount earned by employees through wages, by companies through profits, by landlords through rents, and so on. And so hopefully when we have more output, we get more income, and that's what we mean by economic growth in raw terms. And that's a very simplistic sort of answer. And normally, that means some degree of more input. Depends also on productivity, and so a lot of the time we grow GDP by getting more workers or more capital, and productivity is where we grow it by doing more with the same or less. So in the past 10 years, for example, there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that our productivity growth hasn't been that great, but we've still had GDP growth through that time, and that's mainly been driven by growth in the amount of workers in the economy, in large part through a steady flow of about 200,000 or so a year of workers joining the workforce from abroad. And so it's possible that you can kind of grow GDP and get economic growth without productivity, and it's also possible in other times to grow it without having any more workers or more capital as well. So that's kind of what we talk about when we talk about economic growth. That's the raw mechanics. Another thing, and this isn't just pedantry either, is that economic growth isn't about distribution. You hear a lot of discussions about inclusive growth, and inclusive growth is a valuable idea in many ways, because we do care about the distribution of income. But it's quite possible for a regional economy to grow and not be equitable, and it's still growth. Somebody's still going to gain from it somewhere, and the question is not always to be resolved together. There are situations where the distribution of income can improve and the economy either hasn't grown or maybe has even declined. Often, for example, in a recession, at the national level, we see the income distribution become more equal, because it's people at the top end. City bankers don't get their bonuses that year, and so it's important to recognise that growth and distribution are not always closely connected, and how we shape economic growth may be sometimes a separable question from how we think about distribution. And so distribution is something that we should measure. So we should think about median earnings and poverty rates. Those are valuable indicators to have alongside economic growth, but they're not the same thing. And to some extent, in the long run, probably the more difficult thing to achieve is sustained economic growth. We can always try and tackle distribution by social policy, by changing taxes and benefits. But actually having a growing economy is the kind of the primary thing that we want, because it creates more resources that we can share around. So touching on this point about where growth comes from and sort of starting to unpack this a bit more, when we say more workers, that means actually more bodies, or it can mean more working hours. Over the past few decades, generally working hours have declined somewhat. It's slowed down in the past sort of 20 years in terms of average working hours. But there's still been an element there because we've had an increasing number of people going into part-time work, for example, even if the average working week hasn't sort of declined for full-time workers. Then we've got more capital, and capital takes different forms. The classic form of capital is physical capital. So that can be a factory and the machines that sit in it. It can mean a sort of a computer system now, in the form of a laptop, which is probably the extent that a lot of us have as capital now, especially if we're working from home. Then there's human capital, which is a slightly tricky concept because it always attaches to specific workers. And human capital is what we normally think about in terms of the results of education. So when people get a qualification, they've added some skills which give them human capital, which give them a return over and above what they could get from just their labour. So a worker without any skills to speak of would get just a very basic wage in the labour market because they can move a sweeping brush or whatever. As we add skills, we add human capital, we can charge rent for that human capital. So if we learn how to do something useful like install central heating systems, then actually that's a skill that most people don't have, certainly I don't, that will pay somebody to do something for. And so that's what human capital looks like. And human capital is quite tricky because it is attached to people, because it's not something that you can buy and sell separately from that person's labour. And then there's a further form there of intangible capital, which is sort of an area which is quite new in economic studies, but is of increasing importance. And intangible capital is all the things like research and development knowledge, marketing capital. So if you've built a brand, that's there as well. If you've built a sort of a really intensive customer network, then that's useful for it too. Software, we invest in lots of software which hasn't got a physical presence beyond its place on a hard drive somewhere, often in the cloud these days. But because we've got sort of a license for it, then that's kind of valuable for us, either as the seller of it because it generates revenue for us, or because we've invested in it and allows us to do things. So if you're in a commercial business and you buy a license for Salesforce software, that allows you to much better manage your sales operations and sort of keep track of what everybody's doing. So those are the input side of things. And that then sort of to dive a bit more deeply into productivity, productivity is ultimately about combining workers and capital better to get sort of more from what you put in. And so there's different ways of improving productivity in that way. The first one, and the one that we always think of, is technological innovation. So the Industrial Revolution is the kind of the sort of the hallmark of this, that mill owners invented machines that allowed them to do with much fewer people what they were in terms of their production. As we've moved into a more service-driven economy in more recent decades, process innovation is important. And so using tools like Salesforce, like I said a moment ago, you can actually manage lots of people doing lots of things in really efficient ways. If you think about it in manufacturing, process innovation also matters. If you've heard of just-in-time production, it allows you to keep much lower stocks of parts. So if you're building cars, you don't have to have so many parts sat in a warehouse until they're needed, because you just use them, you buy them as you use them. And then that last one there, better matching of workers and capital to their uses, the information economy that we've had over the past few decades and we've seen grow, a lot of that is about improving our matching of workers to machines and the opportunities that go within, workers to jobs as well. So obviously, if you've got workers with skills that are ill-matched to their current use in the labour market, then actually that's potential dead weight that we're not using. And so being able to sort of adjust that and help people find better jobs is a way that we can improve productivity. Because if I've got really great programming skills and I'm in a job where I'm barely using them, well, it's probably better for the economy if I'm matched to a job which will be able to better use those. So those are all the ways that we can improve how we do things. And so whenever we talk about an economy growing, whether it's a region or a country, it's basically in these kinds of categories that we should be looking for things to happen behind the scenes. Often we talk about the demand side of the economy as driving growth, but in the long run, demand will equal supply, because ultimately we can only buy what can be produced. And so there may be ups and downs because the Bank of England has put up interest rates like it did today, and maybe it puts them up too high sometimes, or maybe it puts them down too low, and that leads to sort of volatility in the economy. And we've all got memories of those kinds of situations, and maybe we're in one now as inflation's sort of moving up towards 6% according to the Bank of England. But overall, in the long run, what we talk about when we talk about economic growth is on the supply side, and it always comes back to more workers, more capital, and combining workers and capital better. So that's what we mean by economic growth. But now we want to talk about economies and functional economic areas in particular. So geography is a really important way of bracketing our thoughts about the economy, because actually economies have a certain coherence at certain levels of geography, and they break down once you go too far below that geography. So I've got an example here, and on the left we've got a regional economic area which is characterized by this quite nice looking 3-story detached suburban home. And on the right hand side we've got a very sort of modern architecture with a water feature office park, and neither of these constitute a coherent economy, because on the left, if we measure GDP by the income method, so that's adding up all the wages and profits and all of that, then the total GDP is pretty high. And if we divide it by the number of people there and do it on a per head basis, let's say it's £25,000, because let's say there's a family of 3 living there, and they have a combined income of £75,000, and there's 3 of them, so it's £25,000 per head. But actually, they all go to work somewhere. Maybe they go to work at the office park on the right-hand side. And so that means the output, the actual value added of goods and services that are created in that house on the left is 0. So nothing is produced there. They live there and they receive their money there, and they probably spend most of it there as well, or by making visits from there. But actually, they don't actually produce anything there. And as it says at the bottom, working from home makes this a lot less clear, and I'll come back to that in a moment. On the right-hand side, you've got the opposite problem. No income is actually received there in principle. Maybe a little tiny bit is if it's a financial company. In fact, it could be a lot if it's a financial company. But let's say these are all building companies and software companies, and so they're owned by somebody distantly, shareholders in another place, and so there are no people who live there who receive income. All the people who work there live in houses like the one on the left, and yet all the goods and services that are being produced there actually have a huge value, and so the output is quite large. And generally speaking, output per head at the business park will be a lot higher than income per head will on the left, because there are children and old people who live in houses on the left-hand side, whereas on the right-hand side, it's only working people that are over there anyway. So you can see that if we divide the economy up into 2 small size categories, we end up with these kind of really weird incoherent economies where lots of things are being produced for high value, but no income is actually being received, or lots of income is being received, but nothing actually happens. And so basically, in order to understand an economy, you have to understand it at a level where most of its value is both being produced in terms of output, but also the proceeds of it is being received as income. And that's what we call a functional economic area. Now, I did promise a brief comment about working from home, making this less clear. There's an interesting philosophical question about whether if I work from home, my output counts here or in my workplace. And in economic terms, it probably counts in the workplace, because actually when the Office for National Statistics counts where people work, it will probably count their jobs in the offices or the workplaces that they are attached to, even if they're not working there. So when I work from home, and when I hopefully add lots of value through my work, it actually gets booked through Emsi Burning Glass's office, which is in Basingstoke, which isn't on a modern office park now, and not through my home. So even there, working from home, although I am actually producing the value in my home as a home worker, it's actually being booked still in my workplace. But anyway, that's enough about that aspect of it. Let's keep on with functional economic areas. So just to illustrate the point, what I've done here, just as a very sort of crude illustration of the point, is I've got every local authority in the UK plotted in terms of the number of people that are employed in that area, and that's on the x-axis, and then the number of jobs that are in that area on the y-axis. And you'll notice the qualifier in each case, because the employed population is resident, so they live there. And then on the y-axis, the jobs are where the workplaces are. And you'll see that although there's quite a sort of a strong tendency for them to line up, and so jobs are roughly similar to the number of people sort of living there, they're not always the same, and there's quite a wide dispersion. And if you go up to the top left, there's one little orange dot, which has got more than 500,000 jobs and actually only a few thousand working people, and that's the City of London, because actually the City of London is a very small area which is full of offices and only has a relatively small amount of residential areas. And so certainly before COVID, hundreds of thousands of people would arrive by commuter transport every day to work there, and yet hardly any of them would actually live there. So the City of London gives us a really good example of an area that on its own is not a functional economic area, because actually most of the money that's being earned there by people is being spread across a much wider area across London and the southeast generally. Most areas aren't quite like that. Most areas are much more aligned, but you can soon start to see how the same problems start to occur. And so actually thinking about how functional economic areas are formed is quite an important way of thinking about regional economies. So we should judge economies by their natural boundaries, not just by lines that are drawn on the map for administrative reasons. You know, so a city has a limit, if we think about a local authority boundary, that has been drawn because that's the historic size of the city. But it doesn't mean the economy starts and ends at that line, not unless you've got like the Berlin Wall as your boundary. So really what we want to try and do is find areas where production roughly equals consumption in very simple form, so where output is equal to income. Now in truth, in a country like Britain, which is very overlapped, we never get quite perfect shapes like this. Even the whole country isn't quite like this anyway, because we know that there's sort of situations on the Irish border, for example, which mean that there's some kind of porousness between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. People work across that border. There's people who cross the Channel by train, or certainly were before COVID, going each way as well. We also know that some of our trading and investment relationships can also weaken it as well. So even at national level, it's not quite so clear cut. But what we try to do is get as close as we can. And so the concept that the Office for National Statistics uses is what's called travel to work areas. And what they seek to do there is maximise the number of people who are living and working in the same area. And so what you'll find is that London is one big travel to work area that covers most of what we would normally consider Greater London. And that's because it has this really extensive transport network there, which means that people in different parts of London go to work in very different parts of London elsewhere. And then in the rest of the country, what you tend to find are urban centres surrounded by a sort of a suburban and peri-urban belt, basically. And so a place's balance between production and consumption makes a big difference to economic opportunity. So if you think about a typical travel to work area, it will always have an urban centre. Well, mostly have an urban centre. And usually in an urban centre, you get a lot more production than consumption. Because if you think about your typical city, and London is certainly like this, but a city like Bristol or Coventry will be the same as well. But in the middle, you have a lot of commercial, office space, factories in certain places as well, where people go to work, they add lots of value through their labour and skills, and then they go home to a much wider area, either in the urban centre or around it. And so actually the production is very concentrated, but the consumption is much more widespread. There's an interesting dimension to this with London, that of course, if you look at London in output terms, in terms of GDP produced and value added, London is astronomically high, especially if you go to central London. But if you look at living standards in terms of the income received by people, London is much less pronounced, because of course that income that is generated by all that production in the centre of London is spread across a really wide area across London and into the southeast, and even as far out as sort of parts of the southwest and the Midlands and the east of England too. And so what you get is kind of a much less pronounced pattern in consumption terms than in production terms. Urban centres are always these kind of really sort of heavy concentrations of production, and we'll come on to the reasons why that's so later. University and tourist towns, as it says there, can slightly break this pattern because people actually go there to consume. And so basically what you'll get is that sort of, if you think about another dimension of the London economy, is that actually people go there to spend their income, often from around the world as well. And same with university towns, that they have an influx of people from around the country and around the world who come spend their money too. So it's a slightly different sort of situation there. But generally, the main point is that urban centres, if you pick a local authority that is a city, then it will tend to have more production than consumption. Suburbs have the reverse situation, because suburbs are where workers who often work in urban centres live. And so that's where they receive their income, that's where they spend their money. And as it says there, often much better for service industry demand, retail and restaurants than production. And of course, this leads to a slightly interesting pattern where, in terms of economic opportunity, where, and we see this quite a lot, especially in the southeast these days, where you get a lot of towns which are very prosperous because they are sort of the kinds of places where people go and live, and they've got jobs in London, or what used to be in London. They might be working from home now. And so they become quite expensive places to live, because those people are paid quite well and bid up house prices and so on. They create a whole economy in terms of service industries around them. So, there are gyms and nice restaurants and shops and so on. But it's actually quite difficult to generate other kinds of economic activity in places like that sometimes, because the concentration of these towns becomes so much on them being nice places to live and having good transport links to where people go to work, often in London and other places, that it's quite difficult to be cost competitive for a business trying to start a factory there or something. The workers are much more diverse in terms of their skills, which is good in some ways, but it means that you don't have the traditional kind of workforce that specialises in certain industries. And so actually these suburban areas can be quite hollowed out economies in some ways if they're not too careful. And then that last point there is that outside of that pattern of urban centres and suburbs, which characterises a lot of the country, you get rural areas which can often be more balanced between production and consumption, because especially if they're more remote from the urban centres, they have to be much more self-sufficient. And so you get kind of a balance of people sort of earning a living and spending their money in the same area. But the main point is, the upshot here is that if we're going to look at economic growth within regions, we always have to try and find the right kind of sort of regional level to understand it properly. Looking at a sort of a too particular geography can often mislead, because if you look at, say, the urban centre on its own, it neglects the fact that a lot of the money is being received and a lot of the skills are being drawn from a much wider area. And the same with the suburb, where you can actually see lots of highly skilled people earning lots of money, but they're not actually doing it in the area. So understanding the sort of the wider pattern is really important. And of course, depending on the sort of the mix of skills and specialisms, different regions will have different kinds of industries, and because industries fundamentally aren't the same, they specialize in different things, different products that they sell, different skills that they use in the production process. Within Emsi Bain and Glass, we are big fans of a measure called location quotients. If you're an analyst customer, you'll probably be familiar with it. And we use location quotients to really tell areas apart by the kind of industries, and we can do the same with occupations as well, that they tend to specialize in. And location quotients are a really simple measure. For a given industry I in a region J, we measure employment in that industry in that region as a share of all of the employment in that region. So that's kind of the percentage of manufacturing in the East Midlands on that top line. And then on the bottom line, what we say is, well, what's the percentage of manufacturing everywhere in the country? So let's say it was 20% in the East Midlands and 10% in the whole of the UK. We divide the 20% by the 10% and we get a location quotient of 2, which means that we've got twice as many jobs in manufacturing in the East Midlands. These numbers are all illustrative, of course, as we would expect given the national pattern, and it gives us a sense of the relative specialisation in different industries. Now, there are some industries, non-tradable industries, they're sometimes called all local industries, which are like healthcare or supermarkets, which are basically just everywhere. They all have similar location quotients. Normally it will be somewhere between sort of 0.75 and 1.25, let's say, because they're driven by demand from residents and they have to be near to residents. So if you think about healthcare, for example, there's no use having hospitals all in Aberdeen and in nowhere else in the rest of the country, because actually people need to be able to get to them. Whereas there are other industries, as we'll come on to in a moment, which can all be in Aberdeen. In fact, oil and gas is pretty much all in Aberdeen in this country. And so, understanding the difference between these kinds of industries that are non-tradable and the others, which are unsurprisingly called tradable industries, a big part of it is that the non-tradable industries are much less varied in terms of their presence within local areas. You tend to see the same industries popping up everywhere. You'll get some variation. If you think about certain parts of London, for example, there are some really big hospitals that perform national functions, and so they'll be slightly higher there. But if you view London as a whole travel to work area, it tends to even out, because actually hospitals are concentrated in certain pockets, but therefore other parts of London have relatively fewer. So that's the sort of the non-tradable industries. But there are these tradable industries which export their products outside of their region, and so if you are in London, for example, tradable industries will often be things like the City of London with financial services and business services. It'll be the technology sector as well, and there'll be others too. If you're in say Derbyshire, you can think of industries in the manufacturing space, things like, for example, Rolls-Royce engines and Toyota cars. And so what these have in common is that the physical location of production and the physical location of consumption can be entirely separated. So when you make a car in the Toyota factory in Burnaston, it's not only for people in Derbyshire that car is being made. Most of them aren't going to stay there. They're going to be transported up and down the country, and some of them are going to be put on a ship and taken overseas as well. Same, even more so with Rolls-Royce aero engines. And so these kind of industries tend to be much more variable in terms of location quotient. And I mentioned about oil and gas earlier. Oil and gas is driven by the location of the oil and gas fields in the North Sea, and so it's massively concentrated in Aberdeen. The number of jobs in oil and gas in most of the country is near zero. In Aberdeen, it's quite high, and therefore I think the sort of the Aberdeen areas location quotient for oil and gas is sort of in the 10 to 20 range, because it's just got a ridiculously high concentration of it compared to other areas. And you see the same pattern with, say, shipbuilding. Barrow upon Furness in Cumbria has sort of a lock hold on a significant part of submarine building work. In fact, it's the only place where we build major submarines in this country. Also in Cumbria, you have sort of a real centre of the nuclear power industry, and nuclear power you don't find in many other places. And so you see how sort of these kinds of industries can just become extremely specialised. And here what I've done is just plotted the location quotients for 3 different headline industries. And on the left-hand side, you've got human health and social work activities, which unsurprisingly is pretty standard across the whole country. There's very little variation in it. Then on the right-hand side, you've got manufacturing, which is much more varied across the whole country. And you can see there, actually, on the kind of the west coast of Cumbria, where you've got the sort of the shipyards and so on, is the highest location quotient for manufacturing. It's got a location quotient of around 4. And then you've got this band across the Midlands and the sort of the Yorkshire and Humber and Lancashire areas as well, and into North Wales. And then in the southeast, it's much less common to have manufacturing, so that they tend to be much darker shades. So that's manufacturing. And then in the middle, we've got information and communication, which is a really interesting one, because it's much more on the road to that really sort of heavily concentrated sector. So you can see it all across central London, and then through the Thames Valley, and then there's sort of a lighter patch around Edinburgh and a similar one around Cambridge. And then the rest of the country is quite dark, because actually it's relatively low profile in the rest of the country. And so understanding sort of the distribution of industries by geography and how the tradable nature of them changes that is really important. So those specializations, though, aren't preserved in aspect. We know industries rise and decline over time, and we know, for example, that the pattern of those increases and declines is not consistent either. So as the information and communications industry has risen, it's risen most of all in London and the Thames Valley. If you think about manufacturing, once upon a time there was quite a sizable manufacturing sector in London and the southeast, but it's declined a lot more than the manufacturing sector in the rest of the country, partly to do with competing demands on labour and capital down there. And so understanding how those regions change is really important. And one of the tools that we have to use this to measure this is shift share analysis. And again, you can find this in the analyst tool that we provide at Emsi and Glass. What shift share analysis does, it's kind of a dynamic counterpart to location quotient. And so what we try to do with shift share analysis is try to break up a change in jobs between 2 years. So let's say between 2005 and 2019 into 3 different components, really. So the first one is, well, we know that over that time, let's say, just to illustrate, jobs across the whole economy have grown by, say, 10%. Well, in that case, we'd expect all industries in all areas to grow by 10%. And so that's the national growth effect. So that's the first element that we strip out. So we say that if there were 1,000 jobs to begin with in 2005 in this industry, and they've grown by 100 jobs, well, that's exactly what we'd expect them to have grown by. The industry mix effect takes account of, well, if you're already strong in this industry and that industry's grown by a certain amount, well, if that growth had happened across the whole country and you were strong in that industry, then you'd expect to see that there. So let's say our industry had grown by 20%. So in this case, our jobs started at 1,000, they've ended up at 1,200. We know 10% of that was a national growth effect, and we know that 20% of it was industry, but of course that includes the 10% from national growth. So basically it's 10%, 100 jobs from national growth effect and 100 jobs from the industry mix effect. But what if jobs in this industry had grown by 1,300? Well, that would give us 100 jobs that we can't really account for, because it's neither the industry mix or the national growth that can take care of it. And it's that unexplained quantity that we call the competitive effect, because that must reflect some local competitive factors that have made the industry more likely to grow in one area than in another. And the important sort of dimension to this is the competitive effect can go both ways. So in our example here, what if jobs hadn't grown by anything, so they stayed at 1,000, even though we'd expected them to grow by 200 jobs given the national growth effect and the industry mix effect? Well, in that case, the competitive effect would be minus 200, because we expected it to grow by 200, it grew by 0, so it must be that there's a loss of jobs because of competitive factors. And it's this kind of competitive effect which is what we use to really explain why industries tend to move up and down in different places at different times. And sort of unpacking those kind of patterns sort of sees quite a strong correlation between the competitive effect and the underlying job change. This is for, I think it's construction over 15 years. And so the mix effect and the national growth effect, which are on the right-hand side, they're the same growth rates everywhere because we just assume that they'll be the same everywhere. And so the residual change of jobs that can't be explained by the mix effect and the national growth effect is what comes back through this competitive growth effect. So in this case, actually, we see quite big changes in the sort of the East Midlands and the Central Belt of Scotland and in Northern Ireland too. So there's a question for us about where those competitive effects come from, and the pat answer is what we call agglomeration effect. And to explain these, we have two main theorists. One on the left is Alfred Marshall, who is the British kind of founder of modern economics. And then on the right-hand side, we have Jane Jacobs, who is I believe, a New Yorker, or if not, she spent a lot of her time writing about New York. And she's not an economist, or she wasn't an economist. She was an urban theorist and wrote a lot about sort of the way that cities were changing and evolving. But she had really good insights from an economic perspective about what that meant for urban economies. And so, these two were separated by, I don't know, probably about 70 years or something like that. So Alfred Marshall, if you've ever heard of John Maynard Keynes, Alfred Marshall taught him economics, put it that way. And so he was writing in the sort of the 1900s, 1910s. And his concern was, why did you get certain industries really concentrating in certain local areas? And so, of course, given the time he was writing in, it was very much an industrial question, because you have coal mining areas, you have shipyards and things like that. And he was interested as to why, at a basic level, why don't we have coal mines everywhere? And why don't we have factories producing cotton mills everywhere? I mean, cotton mills are a much better example in this sense because they're all reliant on an imported raw material. So why don't we have them everywhere? Why were they so concentrated in sort of Yorkshire and Lancashire and those kind of areas? And he theorized and sort of explored the question of that there are what we call in economics externalities, so benefits beyond that which people pay for from specializing in certain industries. And he thought of this in terms of shared natural resources. So that's certainly something with coal mining, for example. You obviously want to put coal mines where there are seams of coal. Same with shipyards as well, because you want to build ships near the coast, because otherwise you're going to take them a long way. So they're all fairly predictable in a way. But there's also other aspects of it that transport costs come into it. Say you've got a supply chain. Well, you don't want to have to ship the parts to the main assembly factory over long distances if you can avoid it. So actually lowering transport costs of industries that are feeding one another actually makes them all concentrate together. And then that feeds into another dimension, which is this common skilled labour pool, which means that actually if you've got all these parts factories and the assembly factory as well in the same place, then they're building a labour pool, which means it's easier to find the kind of workers that you're after. And so all these factors create externalities which make it attractive to concentrate in the same place. And so you can see Alfred Marshall's kind of line of thought when you look around and you see factory towns, We don't see so many of them anymore, although sometimes we see factory towns without a factory now, where these towns are built around a sort of a single or several large assembly plants and the supply chains around them. We still talk about regional supply chains for major manufacturers. So if you think about automotive and aerospace, which are still the big kind of manufacturing concerns that we get, you can think of the parts supply chain that goes around them. And so that's sort of the specialization side of things, which is really important in understanding those kind of tradables, especially in manufacturing and sort of the physical economy. Jane Jacobs was writing in the sort of the post-war era in the 60s and 70s especially about the city and about how it was changing, and her emphasis was on something slightly different, that it's about the way that major cities create sort of the potential for strong economic growth, really by the sort of the concentration of knowledge and activity that goes around it, which all makes it sort of quite a melting pot of economic activity. And so one of the aspects here is what we call knowledge spillovers, that one industry concentrates in a city, and that creates lots of knowledge that can be used in different ways in different businesses. Having businesses that are sort of in similar territory. So if you think about finance and insurance, and then technology that also feeds into finance, has all these kinds of effects with it. You also get in major urban centres universities as well, and they are in some ways knowledge factories, and so they're creating other forms of knowledge spillovers. And of course, cities are built to maximise these kinds of spillovers because they have a shared infrastructure. At the most material level, things like transport systems and so on, but they also have meeting places and restaurants and bars and clubs and things like that, which all allow people to network and meet together, and that creates this sense that a city is the place to be. And so over time, you get these kind of urbanization externalities where it's, if you want to be in the place to be, then that allows you to really kind of maximize your business prospects in certain kinds of business that really thrive on knowledge and on networks and all of that. And so at its height, you think about things like places like London and Milan and New York, which are built on these kinds of externalities, where actually, if you want to start a business in Britain in finance, well, the City of London is the place to be. And if not, it's down the road in Docklands and so on. In technology, you see it too, where it's either London or the Thames Valley are the sort of the real places to be, because you can meet sort of people with similar interests and sort of share partnerships and so on. And the sort of, whereas with Marshall's specialization externalities, the kind of the sort of the hypothetical model is much more about industry. Here it's much more about the service and sort of knowledge intensive sector. So things like business services, digital and things like that. So as it says at the top there, agglomeration on these two theories is not mutually exclusive. You can have an economy where Marshall's specialization is still going on, but you can also see urbanization externalities, as Jane Jacobs would have it, all at the same time, and sometimes they'll interact and sometimes they'll collide, but those are the kind of the two main sorts of forces that we look for in thinking about how economies change. And of course, the Jane Jacobs dimension is quite an interesting one, because it's actually a byproduct of other things that make a city great. And so and we've really seen this as the knowledge intensive economy has grown over the past few decades, that London is a really fascinating case, where if you go to the post-war era, from the sort of the 50s through to the 80s, London was in relative economic decline, and yet since the 80s it started to really boom and has become a real powerhouse within the UK economy. Whereas Marshall's view on specialization at first in the post-war era was continuing to intensify, and then actually has played against it in some ways, because those are the kind of industries that have really sort of struggled to compete. So it's quite interesting how these forces can wax and wane according to sort of wider material conditions. So to sum up then, economies grow by growing their resource base or by being more productive. So as we saw and as we talked about, it's not about sort of questions of demand or distribution in the sort of the long run. It's questions about, have you got more workers, more capital, or can you do more with what you've got? When we talk about economies and regional economic growth, it's really important to understand them in functional terms, that we want some coherent sense of what the region we're talking about is. So we don't want to draw it too narrowly, where we end up with this kind of imbalanced economy because it's where people either live or work. We want an area which has some alignment between where people live and work. Economies specialise around their tradable industries. Those are bringing money into the area because they offer some kind of comparative advantage for it. And these rise and fall over time, and sort of understanding how they're rising and fall over time is really important. And as we saw there, it's agglomeration that is kind of the underlying question about which industries are rising and declining, depending on the sort of the externalities at work, and different places will benefit or suffer accordingly. And so at that point, I've been talking to you about regional economic growth for about 3/4 of an hour, and I think I'm about done. So I think I'll finish it there.